Good evening and welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to remind the audience that this webinar is being recorded. Please note our diversity statement that has been posted to the chat. My name is Marianne Security. I'm chair of the GTA chapter of Dying with Dignity Canada. And together with MAiDHouse, we're pleased to host tonight's free webinar, exploring the experience of supporting a loved one through a medically assisted death. I would like to tell you a little bit about Dying with Dignity Canada and the GTA chapter. First and foremost, we're a national human rights charity committed to improving the quality of dying, protecting end-of-life rights, and helping Canadians avoid unwanted suffering. We believe all Canadians have the right to choose their good death. Through advocacy, personal support, and public education, Dying with Dignity and its chapters ensure Canadians have access to quality end-of-life choices. Our advocacy efforts focus on ensuring that eligibility criteria in assisted dying legislation and access to medical assistance in dying complies with the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We provide support to people, their families, caregivers, and healthcare providers as they explore end-of-life options, including medical assistance in dying. We educate Canadians about all of their legal end-of-life options, including the constitutional right to pursue medical assistance in dying and the importance of advanced care planning. I'm pleased to introduce your moderator for this evening, Stan Byrne. She is a marketing and communications manager and an integral member of the MAiDHouse Communications Committee and a gifted facilitator. I know you will find this evening's discussion informative and valuable. Stan?
Thank you so much. And please continue to let me know if there's any issues with the sound, and Kelsey can help us out in the back end. So hello and thank you to Marianne, thank you to Dying with Dignity, thank you to Tekla, and also to MAiDHouse. We acknowledge that as a virtual event, we span many traditional territories. I encourage you to reflect on the land that you are on and who the traditional and current caretakers of this land are. The land that I am here on is the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendiet, and the Haudenosaunee. Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are all grateful to work, to play, and live and have Zoom webinars on this land. I am so thrilled to be here. Before we start, please note that our session today is being recorded for everyone who registered for the program, but they're having a Monday and they could not make it. It's okay if you're watching this at a later date. I hope you made it through your Monday. I wanted to let you know that the chat is available for people. I encourage you to use it. Please add your comments, use it to connect with audience members, send us feedback, add resources or suggestions. If you would like to ask a question of my esteemed panelists, then please add it to the Q&A function. In about 35 minutes, I'm going to stop the program and the discussion, and I'll go straight to audience questions. Hopefully, I will get to every single question that you ask. Some of you added some questions when you registered for the program, so thank you so much for adding those questions and also for making my job a little bit easier. So I'm very excited for this conversation. I've had the privilege of speaking with both Gaellen and Colleen, and within about 5 minutes of talking to both of them, I was having some of the most meaningful conversations of my life. I am thrilled that we have this hour to hear from them. So first up, we have Gaellen Kalles-Chan. She is a registered nurse practicing in Hamilton, Ontario. She is a nurse on the Assisted Dying Resource and Assessment Service at Hamilton Health Sciences, which serves patients in acute care and community settings. She is passionate about promoting access to MAID and understanding how we can improve the experience of patients and families during the assessment, the provision, and bereavement. Gaellen also enjoys supporting and mentoring new MAID clinicians in their practice, specifically the role of interdisciplinary and nursing supports and their impact on comprehensive MAID care. So welcome, Gaellen. And I also have Colleen. Colleen Ellis is an advocate for MAID. Colleen's father died of MAID in 2021 after being diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. This was Colleen's first experience supporting a loved one through the MAID process. Before her father's death, Colleen knew almost nothing about MAID, and she admits that when a family member first suggested that her dad might be interested in MAID, she thought they were suggesting a house cleaner. Both are very important. So Colleen learned a few things about MAID from her father's death, and she wants to help support others by sharing some of her family's experiences. She is also a mother of 2 grown women. She's a writer, she's a struggling pianist, and she's a passionate vegetable gardener. She lives on the Sunshine Coast north of Vancouver with her husband. I think I noticed something in the chat about somebody also joining from Vancouver, so welcome. Gaellen, I know I just read your bio, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about your work at Hamilton Health Sciences and some of the things that you do?
Of course, thanks, Stan. So I'm Gaellen. I work as a registered nurse at Hamilton Health Sciences, and I have been fortunate enough to be a part of our assisted dying resource and assessment service since 2016. So there was a call put out to everyone at HHS to see if there was staff willing to engage in planning and modeling what MAID care was going to look like. So I have been fortunate enough to be involved right from the beginning. So involved in some policy development work, early days when we really were not sure what this practice was going to look like, what the community patient needs were going to be. And when I look at kind of where we've come from those early days, it's really exciting for me. So I assist in assessment and also provision of MAID care. I do a lot of work with our families in terms of planning what a provision may look like, helping them understand the assessment process. And I also have been now on the team for a while, so I am supporting when we have new independent assessors helping us with assessments on cases. I often will meet with them, kind of talk about our process and make sure that they're feeling well prepared and confident to go in and have these deep, meaningful discussions with patients.
Thank you. Colleen, could you tell us a little bit about your dad and his decision for MAID?
Yeah, thank you, Stan. So my dad was 83 years old when he passed just over a year ago. Up until he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months before he passed away. And up until then, he was healthy. As far as I know, he was a very healthy man. So it came as quite a shock to our family to hear that he had cancer. He was a very, very selfless man. A man, he really didn't want to burden anybody. He didn't want to burden my mom or any of us kids. He was always, his entire life was about helping others. Never even wanted anybody to talk about him. We were joking a couple of weeks ago, we finally had his celebration of life. And when people were, taking the mic and talking about him, we were all joking of how much he would have hated that because he was very selfless and just was always about other people. He did some chemotherapy for, I'm going to guess, maybe 3 months. And it wasn't working for him. And it was making, I think, giving him a lot more discomfort. So really, I think in the end, he was in so much pain, excruciating pain, and his quality of life was completely gone, which is what I heard him say at one point. So it was honestly a blessing for him to have the option of MAID. I know me and my mom, and I'm sure all of my brothers, my siblings, all feel the same way, that it was, we're very grateful that he had that option.
Thank you. So my first question is really for both of you. It's about the time between that second assessment and the provision. So maybe for you first, Colleen, if you don't mind. what happened after your father received his second assessment? And what was that period of time trying to get ready between his second assessment and the provision?
Yeah, definitely wasn't easy. So I know my dad had his first assessment. I was not there for it. A shout out to North Van. I see somebody in the chat was from North Van, and that's where my mom and dad live. So I had traveled to North Van as soon as I learned that my dad was in the hospital. So he's getting close to that time, and he asked the nurse that came to the house to just take him to the hospital and let him die. He wanted to just have it done, and he didn't want to burden anybody. I was there the next day when after a visit with him, and I remember sitting with my mom and one of my brothers and a sister-in-law, and the phone rang, and my mom answered it. And it turned out it was the doctor who was going to interview him for that second assessment. And he was letting my mom know that the following morning he was going up to the hospital to assess my dad. And in that conversation, it came out that if my dad wished to die that day, that the doctor would administer MAID directly after the second assessment if he was to if he was to pass the assessment. So it was a shock to us. And looking back now, of course, it makes sense. It makes complete sense that could happen. But at the time, it was very confusing for us. So my sister-in-law and I got back on the phone. We luckily had the phone number to the doctor that had made the phone call. And we made a call back to him and just said, we need to confirm the information. And he was a very sweet man, very kind doctor. And the information was confirmed that we knew that Dad would probably pass that second assessment. So we knew that we probably only had one more night with him. But unfortunately, at this time, I still had one brother who wasn't in town yet, and my mom, who really needed a couple more days with my dad. She wasn't ready to let him go. So it was a shock. It happened. It was that realization of how quickly it could happen when that second assessment could come around. And I think we weren't ready for it. But like I said, looking back now, when you're not quite as emotional as you are in that time, it makes sense. But it's just, when the emotions are high, it's as we know, it's hard to make sense of anything, right? So it was, it was hard. The next morning, he had his appointment scheduled for the second assessment, and I went to the hospital to see my dad with my sister-in-law, and I asked him if he could hold off for a couple more days, and he quickly agreed, because again, it wasn't about him. It was about what we wanted. He understood that my mom needed a couple more days, and he understood that my brother, one of his sons, wasn't in town yet. So we were really fortunate in the end to have another couple of days where we were all the grandkids and all of us kids and mom and close family flew out from Toronto to be with us. And we all had that time at his bedside for a couple of days. So it was such a gift. But again, a shock. Yeah.
So there was just 2 days. I mean, and it could have happened obviously right away, but there was just 2 days between that second assessment and the provision. And so there must have been so much planning and organizing and flights and travel that happened in that very short amount of time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And then, the sudden realization of what does he want in his final moments? Does he want us all in the room? We hadn't had that conversation at that time. So trying to understand and trying to have that conversation very late in the game, so to speak. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. No, that's important. I noticed someone in the chat too is talking about it as well. So Gaellen, for you, how do you and your team prepare families and loved ones and patients for the provision? And what have you learned in that liminal time, that waiting time in between the second assessment?
What we often hear from our patients and families are that the days between being found eligible and your provision date often feel very long. It is, I would say that's often some of the hardest days for family and for patients. And just to echo what Colleen says, we see most of our patients are more concerned about their family and those that are surrounding them in this process than they are about themselves. I think there's some relief that comes for being found eligible and getting to move towards provision. We often say our patients kind of get a little bit of pep in their step, a little bit of new air within them, and they almost shine a little bit brighter in those final days. And we always say, like, this is how we know that this was the right choice for this patient. Because we do see that impact. I'm very fortunate in Hamilton to work under the guidance of Dr. Andrea Frolick, who's an ethicist, who is one of the leaders on our team. And she herself is a dancer. And so early days, we talked about this notion of it being a bit of a dance between care providers and the patient and their family. And so we use a term called death choreography. Because just as in any dance, we need to talk about what will this look like? How do we make this meaningful? Who will be there on the day? What music might be playing? What meal are you going to enjoy? What legacy work, what memory building can we fit into these days that, yes, they seem very long. We know that you're intolerably suffering. We have heard you loud and clear. There is a team willing and able to help you. But how do we fit in this legacy end of life work that is very important? When we look at families who are bereaved through MAiD, we often hear that when we're able to provide some meaningful time, ideas about legacy work, memory building activities that could be done as a family, that they are able to process that time. It doesn't just feel like this horrific weight and watching somebody suffer. It is time that they are able to reflect on positively. So that's what our cases are showing us.
And Colleen, I saw you nodding a little bit when Gaellen started talking about that shine. Was that something that you noticed a little bit with your father as well in those 2 days?
Absolutely. Yeah. That was nice to hear Gaellen say that. Absolutely. And you know, it was a strange time because I remember the shine, and I remember feeling it's such a hard time, but yet everything feels normal. It was even though he was in hospice and he was in bed, he was able to talk and have conversations with us. So there was a lot of normal about the day as well. He even got up and brushed his teeth in the morning. You know, he had a little bit to eat, but there, yeah, definitely saw that he seemed a little bit happier. Yeah.
And I also love that term dance, like the choreography of the day. Colleen, do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about that day and how your father died? Was there anything that you wished you had known? Was there anything that you felt you needed, you didn't perceive?
Yeah, I love that term too. It really is kind of a dance. And I think really that's what it comes down to. That's what I think as a family that we probably needed, was somebody to help us prepare for that dance. You know, somebody to help us understand the process. I believe we had a pamphlet, and I think a nurse had explained it very briefly to my mom at some point. But I remember we had a pamphlet, we just kept rereading the pamphlet, trying to process the words to understand, you know, how this was all going to play out. But I mean, honestly, if I could dream really, really big and say, if you could tell me that I could have had anything I wanted, I would have loved to have somebody like Gaellen, somebody to kind of explain it to us, what might be possible, how things might, you know, go. And also, you know, things like, you know, to remind us to contact close friends or family. We were lucky that we had family who automatically clued in and realized they needed to be with us and flew out from Toronto to be with us. But not everybody has that. But to find the support to find our own support, and to have that conversation about what Dad would have wanted in his last days. And, you know, did he want music playing in the room? Did he, somebody, I think the doctor at one point suggested that some people even have a bottle of champagne. It turns out my dad wanted none of those things. He just wanted quiet. And then the other, so it's all that, you know, those pieces, those preparation pieces, and there's that little bit of support and help understanding, you know, what to expect. And the other piece to me that was important, and I really don't know if it was to the rest of my family, but to me it was important, is I had never watched anybody die before. And so that was a really big thing. And when I suddenly realized that, I literally chased the doctor down the hallway after the second assessment and said, wait, please don't leave yet. Can you fill in some blanks for me? I need to know, you know, what is it that I'm going to witness? What am I going to see? And honestly, the moments were absolutely beautiful, very hard, of course, but beautiful. The IV that was hooked up to my dad, it was a very, very long IV, and the nurse and the doctor stood way over in the corner of the room so that all of us could gather. We were a big family, so there's a lot of us, so we could gather literally around the bed and sit on the bed with him. It was almost as if they weren't there. You honestly forgot that they were in the room, but it was fast. It was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and it was 2 o'clock. There was no time being wasted. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that patient doctor relationship, which of course it's a confidential relationship, and the doctor is there for my dad. And I remember thinking, I wish we had somebody here for us, for the family. So just, you know, stuff. And I think there's so many great resources out there that MAiDHouse and Dying with Dignity have on their website. I think maybe, you know, even some resources for the family as well would be really, really helpful.
So I'm seeing in the chat quite a few people. Gaellen, you're going to be very, very busy because it sounds like you're going to be flying around the country. You might be going to California. People are going to need you. But it seems like there's a need for this type of support, and people are mentioning some great resources here. There's also the Bridge C14 website has some great resources, along with Canadian Virtual Hospice. And then, and of course, I know a lot of people have also mentioned the end of life doulas that can be connected if you have those type of resources. Gaellen, I know that your team's mandate at Hamilton Health is to gather that data, gather feedback from loved ones about the type of supports that they received. What are you hearing from these families and these loved ones about the type of care and support that they need after the provision or during the provision?
So when we look at our quality data, that we do reach out to our families. Every family is offered a kind of bereavement interview to kind of touch base and allow us opportunities to learn and grow and shape our practice to really have it be meeting the patient and family needs. What we're hearing is that oftentimes families felt that when our team came into the picture, they felt their loved one was being heard. You know, we do see majority of our patients through our inpatient hospital system. We do partner, we have a strong community of MAID providers within Hamilton GTH area. So we do see patients sometimes that are in the community. A lot of times they have been asking for MAID information. They have been describing their suffering in their own ways, and it's really taken somebody on their care team to notice that this is what they're asking for. I've yet to have a patient request to die under Bill C14. It often comes across as a very nuanced way in a discussion about suffering, and I think that as a medical community, we're starting to lean into that discussion more, which is encouraging. So definitely feeling like the families could really take a little bit of a step back as an advocate, feel that their loved one was being heard was huge for them. And then also in terms of bereavement follow-up and needs to help process grief and loss, we're hearing a lot about the need for MAID-specific grief counseling and bereavement support, and that these families are not necessarily feeling super comfortable attending bereavement groups for cancer patient, cancer loss, etc. That MAID and that process is kind of its own experience, and it contributes to grief in a different way, and that we really need nationally to be developing a bereavement support network for MAID families. I'm very encouraged that it's coming. I have some fantastic colleagues who have been doing bereavement support work in Hamilton and are working towards developing a bereavement curriculum. CAMAP, which is the National Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, is also funding some of that through research grants, and they're really committed to also addressing this kind of current gap in practice. And MAID has existed now within Canada for a number of years, and so we're seeing people like Colleen who have been through their journey and who are wanting to connect and wanting to advocate and wanting to support others. So we're hearing a lot about the impact of peer-to-peer support, which is a growing practice as well.
And is CAMAP, is that just for providers and also assessors, or can anybody access that site?
I believe the site is accessible to anyone. I believe that the intention was that it is a community for assessor providers and healthcare workers who engage with MAID work. But it's a fantastic resource, and really kind of leading the front in terms of shaping MAID care within Canada.
Thank you. So this brings up a little bit of a point that we've been talking about, because we've been really focused on, I think, mostly on track 1 patients. Gaellen, do you notice that there's a difference between the supports
I think Stan just froze, but what she was going to ask is, do you notice a difference between track 1 and track 2? So Gaellen, if you want to take it in from there.
Yeah. Thanks, Hecla. So I see a big variation in our practice between track 1 and track 2 patients, just in the amount of support. Just in something as simple as the length of time that the patients are engaged with us for assessment and provision planning. Track 1 is, by legislation, able to be a bit of a faster process. When you're a track 2 patient, the legislation is very clear that you're engaged with us for a longer period of time. Your reflection period is longer. What I have been hearing from track 2 patients is there is quite a bit of digging on the healthcare assessor side to meet the legal requirements to speak with specialists that have been involved in care for the patient. And oftentimes it's just taking time for us to connect with pain specialists, to connect with surgeons that may have been involved, to help keep moving that case forward. And oftentimes it is very frustrating for the patient. And so one thing that we try to do is just keep in touch, keep updates, let them know where we're at with their assessment, what data we still need to get from their care community. And just keep them in the loop. I would imagine that for families, that would also be a really frustrating, difficult process, because you have somebody that you're wanting to advocate and support for. But behind the scenes, we're trying to communicate or coordinate communication between lots of healthcare professionals often, and that is a struggle all in its own. So Track 2 patients need a ton of support, and it's a heavy weight if you assess and provide as kind of a small group or a lone assessor provider. That's a lot of work.
Thank you, Tekla, for stepping in when my internet went out. Gaellen, can you explain just briefly the difference between track 1 and track 2?
For sure. So the major difference between track 1 and track 2, a track 1 patient would have a reasonably foreseeable death. A track 2 patient would not. So just kind of anecdotally, I can tell you most cancer patients, people with life-limiting illness would be a track 1, and then patients with more like complex pain issues would kind of fall into the track 2 category, just to give people an idea.
Thank you. So just bringing it back to that community piece that you mentioned a little bit for track 2, Colleen, how was the experience of telling people in your life that your father had received MAID? Were people generally supportive?
I would say 90% of the people were very, very supportive. It's funny that you asked that, because I remember chuckling a bit right before my dad's second assessment, I think it was, and my dad turned to me and said, a lot of people are going to think that I'm just chickening out on life. And he was worried about how some people might, he says, they're going to think that I'm just a quitter, I think is what he said. And I think that's one reason that I wanted to do this panel too, is to help carry on that kind of that legacy. Most of the people that our family or myself have talked to have been so supportive that the question is usually, how do I get in on that if I ever have the option? They want information, they want to know more about it. And there's been, a handful who don't really want to hear me saying how my father died. So I quickly learned that, maybe I want to pick and choose how much information I give to people. But mostly, absolutely, the vast majority were very supportive.
Gaellen, what have you noticed in terms of that? And what about if someone has a disagreement, if there's a disagreement between loved ones or family members, either the day or even the decision?
Yeah, it definitely comes up. We try to make space and create an environment where everybody feels that they're able to come and support their loved one. We often have conversations about, is this somebody who feels that they can't be there to hear your assessment? Would it be helpful for them to come and hear an assessment? Is this somebody who might step out of the room during the actual provision and come back in and essentially have it look like a natural death has occurred? And so we don't require anything of anyone. We hold space. We let people decide what they're comfortable with. We try to help open up discussions. I will say most people have lots of support in their circles. And a lot of times it's not people having barriers or fears. It's not motivated by not agreeing with MAID. It's, like Colleen said, not having witnessed death before. And so is that just a learning need that I can easily help have a conversation about? And so I think that you have to keep open communication. We have to respect where people are at. And at the end of the day, this is really about the patient and what they want their death to look like. And so we support that as much as possible.
And would you give any feedback just in terms of how the families reacted when they were told, this is from the chat, they were not eligible, the person was not eligible after all of their advocacy work? Yeah.
My heart breaks every time we have to tell somebody they're not eligible. It's always the hardest conversations when you do this work. we really try to take time to make sure everyone who has been supporting and rallying this patient through this process understands why they're not eligible. They can understand avenues if they don't agree with our assessment, how that assessment could be challenged. Kind of the beauty is that you could just go to have another assessment and find another assessor. And then we also assure them that, you know, supports like palliative care don't disappear just because you have explored MAID. There's the teams of people who want you to have a dignified death, a death that you are comfortable with, willing and able to support you. And so we try to make sure that we don't leave our families feeling like there are no other care options for their loved one.
So this is a question that came up in a couple people asked this question when they registered, and they have a loved one who's considering MAID, but they are concerned about consent, they're informed consent, they're concerned about capacity issues that might come up either, you know, they're currently happening or they might come up, you know, depending on how long they wait. What would you say to people who have those concerns, who are supporting their loved ones?
Yeah, I definitely, again, I have a lot of empathy for people who are supporting with that fear, knowing that, you know, consent and capacity for decision making is really important in the MAID process. So currently, we at times would assess capacity on a case-by-case basis. Its capacity is often a fluid thing. So while somebody may be having like adjustments to their pain medication and maybe they're not having great capacity one day, it doesn't mean that the process stops and that it can never be revisited. We oftentimes will go back to see patients. So we treat it as a really fluid thing. At times, so one of the new changes to some legislation has allowed what's considered a waiver of final consent. I know that there's more information about that on the MAiDHouse and DWDC webpage. So if people could go in to read a little bit more about that, again, it can't be offered in every case, but I do see that legislation is starting to acknowledge that somebody could get through a huge bulk of this work of this process and have everything come down to capacity when, you know, they have a natural process that sometimes makes their capacity a little bit of a fluid thing. So yeah.
Well, thank you. So I have some great questions in the Q&A. The first is it possible for a person with perfect physical health but untenable, long-standing, I guess, mental health issues with no chance of real help to get MAID? And is it possible, number two, is it possible for somebody with unfixable chronic pain but not at end of life to get MAID? So that's sort of a
So I think we're talking a little bit about track 2 when we talk about patients that would have chronic pain conditions, but not a naturally foreseeable death. Those patients would fall into the track 2 category. What we are seeing, I believe in March of this upcoming year, is the creation of track 3, which will be patients with primary mental health diagnoses and their ability to access MAID. Like most things in the MAID world, that is an ever-evolving track. I'm not sure what that will look like, so it's hard for me to speak to it exactly. But I would say to keep exploring, keep your ears open, keep in touch with MAiDHouse and Dying with Dignity and other organizations, because that is coming.
And a few people are also asking about advanced care directives, or have really similar questions about advanced care. So if you make your wishes known, but you're not able to ask for it because perhaps you got into an accident, something happened, I realize, Gaellen, you're not a lawyer, but do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I want to be careful because the last thing I would want to do is have somebody feel like they're not eligible to pursue MAiD when perhaps they are. So I would say everything needs to be looked at on a case for case basis. It doesn't hurt to try and connect with a MAiD provider, a MAiD team in your area, just to explore or do some research on your own. To my knowledge right now, there is no advanced directive planning for MAiD. Whether we see that develop in the future, I know there's some work being done on that, but currently that's not an option. And
this question, we touched on it, is my husband is a terminal brain cancer patient who fought and has lived 12 years, and 2 years ago, the treatment stopped working. And it's been affecting his overall quality of life. He's made the decision to move into palliative care and applied for MAiD. We're now a month away from his provision. What sort of resources are available for bereavement?
So I think it depends a lot on where this person is located, which I hate to say because I wish there was equal access for everybody. I know that there is some Canadian Virtual Hospice has some resources. Bridge C14 has some bereavement resources. I would also strongly suggest that you reach out to the providing physician or NP and ask if they have anybody that they would work with or refer to for bereavement support. And then look at your own resources. Do you have a supportive family doctor that you can access? It's probably a good time to think about even circle of close friends. Who knows about the provision? Are they supportive? Can you kind of create your own little circle moving closer to the state?
So the next question is, my client had no idea that MAiD could be provided at home. They live in Etobicoke. They got connected with a doctor in North Bay, and they have chosen November as their time to receive MAiD, but they're under the impression they have to travel all the way to North Bay. Is there information that we can transfer to the doctor in North Bay, or someone who can provide MAiD at home in Etobicoke?
That is a really tricky case. Again, I understand that I'm really privileged to work in the team that I work with. So I'm not overly familiar with how the provincial referral services are currently, what state they're in. I would guess that the best person to reach back out to would be that provincial referral service, and ask them more specific questions about the case, and again, just even reaching out to the assessing physician or NP who's going to be the provider, to ask them what the day would actually look like, where it would be, what needs to be done before then. So they should be able to provide you some more information.
And maybe, Gaellen, just to give you a bit of a break, I think, Colleen, you could probably answer this one. Can an assessment be done as soon as a person has terminal diagnosis, so that when things progress to the point, the individual may not have capacity for MAiD? Oh, actually, maybe this is a Gaellen question. There's still an option, and if so, when's the final timing decided? So, I mean, Colleen, you have a little bit of insight to that, but probably Gaellen in terms of when they no longer have capacity.
So I just want to make sure I understand the question. So it's a case where a patient would not have capacity at the time of their provision. Is that right?
I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Again, really tricky question. If this was like a track 1 patient, so a patient who had a reasonably foreseeable natural death, who had been already found eligible, it would be up to the discretion of the provider whether or not they would offer the waiver of final consent. So that would be somebody where we're worried about their capacity fluctuating, we're worried about them losing capacity. And so it's very individual. Again, it's a case by case. It is up to assessors and providers to have these discussions, but it is a potential option.
And this next question, it ties into something that Colleen talked about. What is the way that you provide MAID? So she is somebody, she says, we have no idea what's going to happen on the day and what we might experience.
So we always talk a little bit about who will be there. Do they want to be sitting in the bed with the patient? Do they want to have music playing? We have had this happen in people's homes, in people's backyards. Some of the most beautiful deaths that I have ever been privileged enough to be present for have been MAID deaths. I always say, you know, just like we talked about the shining light, because people have this relief that their provision is coming. We often find the day of they're almost joyous sometimes. While it's very sad, and you know, most MAID patients are terribly concerned for their family and are very sad that they're having to leave. And so we talk a little bit about that. We talk about the fact that they will go from this very shining, bright, true to themselves person to being unconscious really quickly. Definitely our more frail patients, I always do talk to families that it may look like they've died while we're providing medications. And that's a common event. If somebody's elderly, if they're very frail, we would, you know, continue our policies to continue providing all the medications. One part that I would always think is important to talk to families about too is that we check for deep sedation before we would provide the second half of the medications. And so that involves us touching and talking to the person. And we're of course as gentle as we can, but I would imagine it would be distressing if this was your loved one and you didn't know that we were going to be talking to them and touching them. And that the process is very quick. And so they go from being very alive to very not alive very quickly. And that is often a little difficult for our brains to process, and that's okay. And it's going to feel a little weird and it's going to feel really sad. And that it's okay to have whatever response you naturally need to have to that. So.
So this is, there's two questions here really, maybe for Colleen. You mentioned that you would have appreciated having a person to support the family present at the provision. Are there areas of service that you found were lacking? Are there things that would have been helpful that you didn't have access to?
Good questions. I think a lot of it's what we're talking about right now. There's just the real practical questions, like somebody, like Gaellen just said, it's, you know, things happen fast and they go unconscious real quick. It's just the things we're talking about of what can we expect. And I know every situation is probably quite different, but it's just really how might this unfold? And so it's really just all that practical stuff. And just, yeah, being prepared that, like Gaellen just said, that was a huge part for me that I will never forget, is how fast my dad was gone. It was very, very quick. So things like that are just really helpful. I kind of wish that I had been a little bit more prepared for that. I don't know if that answers the question, but it really, it's to what the things that I wanted to know are pretty much everything we're talking about right now.
And Gaellen, do you know of any counselors or therapists, social workers, psychotherapists that are providing counseling services for individuals or families who are preparing for, like, specifically or managing MAID? So this is a question from a psychotherapist who says she has have a passion for supporting the population, but they've not been able to find any peer-to-peer support for families, or and just to find support in helping the population.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of a gap in terms of there are a lot of passionate people developing curriculums, developing care strategies for bereavement for MAID. they're coming. I think it again is really dependent on where you are in the country, what access is, who you have access to. So I would again try to connect with local psychotherapists, or ask through your providing team, assessing team, because they may have somebody locally that they're aware of to connect you with. And I would also again say CAMAP would be a great resource, even just what information is available on their website, because they are really about connecting health professionals who are engaging in MAID care and MAID aftercare, and helping them connect and create communities of practice.
Okay, so again, CAMAP. And so if you're a person who is remote, you live in, in a rural community, you don't necessarily live in Hamilton, although all of us are now going to move there so that we can connect more with you. Like a great resource to start with would be CAMAP, whether you are a provider, whether you are like a family of or a loved one.
Yeah, and I would say virtual hospice, Bridge C14. There are some really great resources there as well.
And does your MAID team, do they have a social worker? Do you have a social worker on your team specifically?
So we are really fortunate in Hamilton. We're an interprofessional team. So we have social work with us. We have spiritual and psychosocial care providers that are part of the team. We have ethics access. And again, I completely would like to just speak to how privileged I am to work on this team, because I know that not everybody works in an environment with a lot of resources like that. So I would strongly encourage you to connect and build your own community of practice as much as you can, and know that there's a lot of people wanting to see that part of MAID care continue to expand.
So I have one more question. It's still on consent, which is it's a huge, and capacity, such a huge issue. A follow-up: if an assessment is done and deemed eligible, but the patient loses capacity for the final consent prior to the plan date, are the family members or alternate decision makers able to coordinate an earlier date to sort of hasten any kind of expected downturn or in the condition of the patient?
The only person who can consent is the patient. And so there is no way other than whether that waiver of final consent is offered and used. There is no way of having a POA step in to even, and I know it's very, very challenging. And again, one of those heartbreaking moments doing this work when, unfortunately someone's capacity declines and we're not able to move ahead with provision as planned, knowing that, capacity can fluctuate. Capacity is a fluid thing, and whether we revisit that or not.
Thank you. So I wanted to thank everybody who joined us tonight. I know Tekla is going to speak a little bit about MAiDHouse. I also want to thank Tekla and Dying with Dignity Canada, the GTA chapter. Thank you so much to Gaellen and Colleen as well for sharing your wisdom tonight.
So thank you very much to Stan, Colleen, and Gaellen, again, as Stan mentioned, for sharing your wisdom, your experience, also to the audience for asking your questions and sharing your experiences in the resources and then the chat. There is a lot of information people are looking about how to be eligible, about the procedure, about the day of, about after MAID. There's resources such as books, end-of-life doulas, life celebrants, social workers. There's Dying with Dignity Canada has a lot of resources, Bridge C14, the Canadian Virtual Hospice, and MAiDHouse. So my name is Tekla Hendrickson, and I'm the Executive Director of MAiDHouse, and we're a non-profit organization devoted to providing those eligible to receive MAID with a supportive, inclusive, and comfortable setting. We're learning a lot about how to support the families and friends and others who are supporting those who are having MAID, and developing resources as we go. So we invite you to explore our website and subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about our programming. Shortly, we will also be posting guides for people who are supporting someone through MAID. Also, your local chapter of Dying with Dignity Canada, like this great Greater Toronto chapter, host events around advanced planning and have resources in your local community. So thank you very much for joining our virtual event, presented in partnership again with Greater Toronto Area Chapter Dying with Dignity Canada and MAiDHouse. We thank you to our individual donors who make it possible to provide these virtual events free of charge. And we encourage you to answer the poll, as the information that you provide there is what we use to plan for future virtual events. So take care, and wishing you a very good evening.